Well, I'm joined on the line to discuss that now with the former First Tuesday producer, Tim Tate. Hi, Tim. Welcome to the Politics Show. Tim, can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Tim, what did you make of the programme on Tuesday, the Panorama? Because, as I've been saying there are quite a lot of suspicions, really, that this was a partial documentary. Was it the sort of documentary you would have made?
Probably not, no. I think the difficulty is that Panorama got sucked into some of the very same faults as the prime source of the allegations that they were complaining about, and that's this organisation Exaro News. And I think if Panorama essentially did much the same as Exaro has done, which is to rely on witnesses or testimony from people who cannot support and their allegations and really have severe credibility issues.
So, I mean, I suppose what you're saying there is that, and it hadn't actually occurred to me, that Panorama were relying on the same unreliable witnesses that Exaro had been.
Yes, I mean, that's roughly what I was trying to point out in my blog the other day. It's perfectly reasonable to question Exaro's behaviour, which has been both bizarre and, in my view, very dangerous. But to base a fair amount of your demolition job on Exaro on the evidence of a witness who Panorama themselves on air said worried about his reliability, and rightly, I think is equally dubious.
Let's just go back 20 years or so to when you did a documentary about this, because you actually did uncover that there were some very powerful paedophiles in the Republican Party in the United States. I mean, we're obviously not saying necessarily that sort of thing's going on here in Britain, but what did you discover was happening in America?
What I discovered was allegations, and what I did with those allegations was to seek some form of corroborative evidence, which is, I think, the great problem here, that there has been very little effort expended to seek corroboration. And I found the corroboration I need for that film in an entire room full of documents which were grand jury testimony and indeed testimony before a state Senate inquiry.
So what was actually going on in the United States in the Republican Party?
Well, the allegation was that children in Nebraska, in that case, had been prostituted across the state and indeed to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., up to and including the doors of Capitol Hill. And there was a deal of testimony given largely in secret, as I say, at grand jury hearings or state Senate hearings, which corroborated each other.
Now, I noticed that here in the UK, when that Panorama documentary was going on, the Metropolitan Police actually issued a press release, or certainly a statement of some sort. As the documentary itself was going out, it was starting to appear on the websites of some of the broadsheet newspapers, actually saying that the result of that programme on Tuesday could be to intimidate witnesses. I mean, do you think that's a fair thing to do? Because it actually seems like what they were doing was, even though they had agreed to participate in the Panorama programme, they were criticising it too.
Well, to the best of my knowledge, and if I'm wrong, I apologise, that statement from the Met was issued prior to broadcast, and whether the Met, I'd be surprised if the Met saw the film before broadcast, because that would be a very unusual step for any broadcaster to take. The Met statement was odd. There was nothing in that film which, in my view, would deter a victim of child sexual abuse from coming forward and making a complaint. Whatever else its faults, that film did not do what its enemies, and that's primarily, again, Exaro alleged it would do, which was, and I quote, to smear smear survivors of child sexual abuse. I mean, it just didn't do that, and it was, frankly, something of a damp squib in every other sense.
I mean, if you had the budget of Panorama, which is a pretty astronomical amount, what would you have done differently? Because, I mean, when I was looking at it, I was thinking, well, they seem to be focusing on some of the bad witnesses. I mean, there are actually very good witnesses out there. Is it fair for Panorama to make a programme where it looks like they have focused on witnesses who are unreliable? Because there is some evidence, isn't there? And they were actually effectively saying, and this was the headline, I think, in the Daily Mail, on the front page of the Daily Mail today, that was exonerating Leon Brittan of any kind of involvement in this.
Yeah, I think there's 2 or 3 separate questions. Working backwards, Panorama did certainly give the impression at the end that Leon Brittan was a man whose reputation had been unfairly traduced by a succession of bogus or dodgy allegations. There is some truth, I think, in that, insofar as the allegations are dubious or, at best, unreliable because of the sources of those informations. That does not make them wrong. It does not make them necessarily false. It just means they are very suspect, and you have to tread very carefully. However, there is other evidence which I've published, both on my website and indeed through national newspapers, which shows, for example, that there is a formal statement from a customs officer to the Metropolitan Police's Operation Fernbridge, in which he describes stopping Leon Brittan at customs at Dover, searching his car and finding a child pornography videotape. Now, that is a formal statement. It's sitting in the files of Operation Fernbridge. Panorama knows about that. It's no great secret. I published it last year. If you're going to raise the issue of Leon Brittan, I think it's only right that you do so in a responsible, even-handed, and indeed accurate way, and I don't think Panorama did that. All of that said, I don't think Panorama's the problem. I mean, I think in 10, 5, or even 4 years' time, that Panorama programme will not really trouble anyone as a particularly fine piece of journalism. The problem is what, unfortunately, you have to recognise as the other side, and that's the increasingly hysterical shouting of those who proclaim that there is cast iron evidence of a VIP or political paedophile ring. And there could be. I'm not saying there isn't. What I'm saying is that the absolute certainty with which this has been proclaimed in very loud voices and all over both the mainstream and the social media is absolutely very, very dangerous, because there isn't the solid evidence to support it yet.
What about the complaints that have been to the IPCC, Independent Police Complaints Commission, allegedly anyway, by up to 5 special branch officers that they witnessed investigations being closed down, Tim?
To the best of my knowledge, what the IPCC has said is that it is investigating a number, it's a fairly large number, of cases in which allegations have been made that police investigations were closed down, and that indeed, certainly in some of these cases those allegations have come from former police officers. And that, I think, is very, very serious. I think that's, if the IPCC's investigations show that is true, and that those investigations were closed down, then I think that is a very serious scandal. But, and I keep having to come back to this, what we are dealing with at this stage is allegations. And it's perfectly fair and right, in my view as a journalist, to say, well, we report those allegations. What is not good journalism, and is in this overheated climate is very dangerous, is to proclaim those allegations as fact.
Now, your blog, which is at timtate.co.uk, you talk about the louse and the flea. Why do you draw some sort of analogy between this Brothers Grimm fairy tale and what was going on Panorama on Tuesday?
Well, for those who haven't read Grimm's fairy tale number 30, the tale of the louse and the flea, it's very briefly, it's the story of a louse and a flea who lived together very happily, and the louse had a catastrophic accident while brewing some beer. It threw the flea into a tailspin, and the ensuing drama consumed the entire household objects, a child, and a stream which overflowed and finally drowned everybody. What struck me, both about the Panorama and about the allegations it was investigating, emanating, again, I have to stress this, primarily from Exaro, is that what has happened is that Exaro has published without any due diligence, any corroborative checks, very serious allegations, has sent the mainstream media and social media and the climate, if you like, into a tailspin, much as the louse's demise did with everything in its house. And Panorama sadly fell into the trap, it became the flea, of following the same pattern. What has happened is that this has become trench warfare, with people on either side of the argument shouting at each other and adopting a position which is binary. It's either all true or it's all false. And the reality is that there are going to be bits of this that are true, there are going to be bits of this that are false, and what is needed, and if this is my main interest, if you like, as a journalist, as an old in the tooth journalist, is that when you're dealing with allegations, incendiary allegations, you don't just shove them up on a website or sell them to a tabloid newspaper or an Australian television company, as Exaro did, and say, well, we're just publishing, or we're just publishing what people told us. You actually have a duty to do some investigation of your own, to check out the background, and to try and find some corroborative evidence. And if you don't, what you're doing is not free speech. It's actually undermining both free speech, and it is creating a climate in which good child protection and the protection of children from sexual abuse is going to be set back. It's going to be washed away in the backlash, which is growing and is becoming ever nastier, in my view.
But Tim, surely the only reason that this has been journalists, maybe on very low budgets, have been dealing with this story is because the police simply haven't been doing their job. And when they have started doing their job, I noticed on the LBC website, one of their top clips from the last week was one of the former police officers rang into LBC saying that they'd been investigating a massive paedophile ring, including some very senior figures in the East End. And the night before,
you, Tony.
Sorry,
I can barely hear you.
Now is that some former police officer rang into LBC, the London station, earlier this week and said that an investigation into a paedophile ring in the East End, where there had been several very senior people involved in that, they were about to make mass arrests, and it was just simply the night before the superintendent announced, well, the on-highs have been onto us, we're going to have to end this investigation, there'll be no arrests in the morning. When that sort of culture is around in the police, isn't it inevitable that the media, whether right or wrong, good or bad, are going to start picking up these allegations?
It's certainly inevitable, and I think, to be honest, it's right. I mean, it's one of the things we should be doing, and it's the great sorrow that, by and large, my colleagues have failed to do that for many years. One of our jobs is to be the watchdog that barks at power. But You can't simply say, well, someone's made an allegation, I'm going to stick it out there and present it as fact, which is precisely what Exaro has done.
Now, isn't part of the reason for that, Tim, the fact that we don't really have the kind of massive budgets that people like you used to have back in the 1980s to make big...
I hate to disagree with you, Tony, but I happen to have seen Exaro's accounts. And Exaro was started with a £5 million loan. It has spent approximately £2.5 million of that over the last couple of years. Now, frankly, even in the glory days on the Cook Report or on First Tuesday or thereafter, I never had that kind of money.
Okay, Tim Tate, your website, maybe you'd like to just give that a plug and tell us about some of the books you published recently, because I know you're pretty knowledgeable about this and a pretty prolific author.
Yeah, should anyone want to look, it's timtate.co.uk. My latest book is a book called Yorkshire Ripper, The Secret Murders, which is, I think, precisely the sort of journalism and investigative journalism which I've been criticising others for not doing. It stems from a 3-year investigation by a former police officer. It deals very carefully with facts, and it looks and found corroborative evidence which showed that Peter Sutcliffe is the most likely suspect for 23 unsolved murders, in addition to those for which he was convicted.
Okay, investigative journalist, former producer for First Tuesday. Thanks very much for joining us on The Politics Show.
Thanks a lot, Tony.
You can listen again to any shows at bcfmradio.com and leave comments about your favourite programmes. BCFM 93.2, your interactive station 24 hours a day.